So I guess officially we should probably thank you for coming on and spending your Sunday evening in the desert with us. But I really want to start out with your origin story and to the work you've done up to date. And then if you want to kind of like finish up with what you're currently doing, yeah, that would be helpful for not only us, but our audience to know.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for having me and chatting with me this afternoon. I hope I can do justice and honor to the conversation topic and really, I'll, speak to the work that you both are doing. So I'm going to try my best today for sure. And thanks again for having me. But to share a little bit about myself, my name is Hannah. I'm a social worker and public health candidate currently at Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And my journey and path into social work, I think, started at a pretty young age. When I first began my undergraduate studies, I kind of knew that connecting with other people, talking to other people, understanding larger systems and structures within my community and other communities was really important to me. But I didn't know what that could look like. I didn't know what professions that might like transform into. So I actually ended up majoring in social work and Spanish because I had this love for the language. I found it to be really interesting. And I loved being able to have this new avenue to communicate with other people. So when I started in school, I quickly connected with a mentor through the Boys and Girls Club who introduced me to a population that I wasn't personally familiar with. And that was around 2010 or 2011. And she was a lawyer working in Yolo County Juvenile Detention Center where she was working with unaccompanied immigrant youth. And she introduced me to these kids, brought me into the detention center, and I slowly started to learn about young people who were essentially immigrating from mostly Central America, but really all over the world, and coming to the US to escape persecution, to escape gang recruitment, to stabilize economically or financially, and to really be able to live like a full life of, happiness and well-being. And so I went into these detention centers, and it really shook me on a personal level, just looking at the conditions these kids were living in, the stories they had, and the circumstances that really brought them there. It was really incredible to me that young people who wanted to study, who wanted to be part of society, who really just wanted to work, were being criminalized just for trying to kind of fulfill that basic right that all of us think we are sort of entitled to, right? And so I brought a program to UC Berkeley where we started gathering undergraduate students to go into a detention center in Fairfield and bring resources and community and network to these kids who were detained for, unknown periods of time, who were being shifted to different detention centers across the country. Who had no contact with their family, who didn't understand the legal system, and who were just kind of lost and confused. And some of these kids were super young, and it was at a time.
Yeah. What were the age ranges? Like what kind of?
Yeah, so the facility that I ended up working in the most was teenage boys, but I've seen kids in the system starting around 6 to 8 years old. And just to give more context to the term unaccompanied minor, that is a child of any age who comes into the US without a parent or guardian. And they may be coming to reunify with someone or to connect with someone they know in the US, but really they're coming on their own and navigating things on their own. So the youth I was working with were mostly teens, but I had encountered kids of all ages for sure. At any rate, we started building this club and organization, and people got really excited about it. And I also had this really strong connection with the Boys and Girls Club of San Francisco. And I would work in their summer programs when I wasn't in school. And that was how I really became to love youth development programs, various extracurricular activities that I learned about being available for kids in the city and all over the Bay Area. And so I kind of started to formulate an idea of where my passion and interest was professionally, where I was getting the most joy and satisfaction in my career. And so I knew it was kind of around youth and families, and I knew that this was on another level, that a population I was really interested in and felt very connected to were these kids who were unaccompanied minors. When I graduated from undergrad, I ended up working for the Boys and Girls Club of San Francisco in their education department, worked on Treasure Island and in the Western Addition, and I loved that job. And I met some really wonderful people there, one of whom is here with us today.
Yes, indeed.
And so in that capacity, I kind of saw the wide range of ways in which we interact with kids. Your lens may be educational academic services, but I started to look at how all these other factors influence the way a child can be successful in academia, in their social lives, in recreation. So a lot of that position was relationship building with families and teachers, working with various stakeholders in the community, whether it was the Western Addition Garden or their middle school counselor or the local businesses on Haight Street. It was really looking at the ways in which the different influences for kids could really bolster their ability to perform well academically, because we know that when things are happening at home or out in the community, they may not be able to perform at their absolute best. So that's when I started to look at these different factors that ended up playing a role in my pursuit of a MSW.
Can I interject for 1 second? Because I think sometimes not only folks who are engaged in this kind of work or who are interested in this kind of work can kind of glaze over these other outside factors, right? I don't think a lot of people really take into account the outside factors that affect people on a day-to-day basis, specifically the communities that you're dealing with. So if you don't mind going into maybe covering 3 or however many you really want to, what are some outside factors that really do either hinder some of the kids or these communities from being successful, or are aiding them in their development?
Absolutely. Yeah, and these are things that in my current capacity as a researcher, I've been looking more and more at, and they've kind of started to pop within the research communities. And in health and public health, we call them social determinants of health, and they're largely viewed at in terms of one's ability to be healthy or take care of themselves. And in another lens, they're called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so some folks have heard about that. And both of them, to me, they're kind of looking at the same thing, which is what you're talking about. These kind of external factors that impact us and our ability to perform and take care of our health, to be good at our jobs, or to do well in academia. So in my experience working with the communities that I have, there are a couple of things, particularly in California, that I think can be large barriers to people being able to access certain services or accomplish various things in their day-to-day life. One thing is housing, for sure. Just within, the last 5 to 10 years, I've noticed a lot of children and families being impacted by eviction and the surge of housing prices and the unaffordability of places like the Bay Area or even Southern California. So when your housing situation is precarious and you feel like there's always a chance that you might have to relocate, or you're looking for a place that you can afford, or your income isn't covering all the bills and you're going to have to leave, that places a lot of stress and compression on families and, by way, on children. And so that type of stress not only impacts your health, but it can impact your ability to focus in school. It can impact your ability to do homework at night or to get help with your homework. So I would say housing is a main thing that I've seen impact children and families. The other thing, and I would say this kind of element impacts a lot of kids who are pursuing higher education and also folks who are trying to take care of their health, and that is legal status, right? So among the undocumented children and families I've worked with, the ability to access legal programs or the ability to apply for legal status, whether that's a temporary status, permanent residency, or citizenship, can really lock them out of certain opportunities that will give them either economic mobility or the ability to access the healthcare system. In my current research, one myth I've encountered a lot among folks is that undocumented individuals access public services. That's absolutely not true. We know that if you cannot provide proof of legal status, that you don't meet eligibility requirements. So being able to utilize programs like Medicaid or food stamps, which are sometimes like very essential for families to survive and to be able to support themselves on a daily basis, is a huge barrier to people being able to reach their, to really operate on a day-to-day level in school or in their jobs. And on another hand, it can be a huge barrier to accessing college or any sort of job, vocational training, anything like that. We know that employers and we know that universities often ask for a social security number or work authorization. If you don't have access to those things, it's going to be very difficult to make ends meet or to seek out opportunities where you don't need to show proof of legal status. So I would say that's another big barrier.
Yeah, that's difficult. I mean, college seems like so far away if you're trying to take care of your, those basic human necessities of like having shelter and finding food. The last thing on your mind is like, oh, let's see what's going to happen when I go to college. Like college could seem so far away, and you could argue that if it's that far away, it doesn't really, it could be considered something that you don't necessarily need.
Not even like an option for you or a thought.
Sure.
But I'm curious. So this is interesting. Like, if you're an undocumented family, you're here, you don't have money to like go anywhere else or do anything else. Your resources are super limited. I think that you can get into public school, like elementary or like up to high school without documentation. And then is it just like maybe the few nonprofits that are available? Like what services are available to these people that don't have documentation and are trying to build something for themselves here?
Right. So you're absolutely right. Public school is available to all children in this country. So at least in the state of California, I know for sure you don't have to show proof of legal status. And that, of course, will serve you up until age 18. But it can be really tricky to get into a college or to secure employment without a social security number. That's why programs like DACA kind of came up, right? Because as a country, we wanted to support these kids who had spent most of their life growing up here, maybe lacked the social security number or work authorization to integrate into higher education or employment, and were given that opportunity through this temporary status. Now, that's a highly debated, controversial program, but that was one opportunity for some kids. Now, when it comes to like financial assistance for college or other opportunities, you're absolutely right. There are nonprofits, but the funds are very limited and the resources are very limited. And there is, there's still the barrier of coming for, even if you are in a community college or whatnot. I think I cannot speak for this population, but whenever you're kind of revealing yourself to either a large institution or a government funded institution, you're giving out your data, right? So that can be a really scary thing for folks. So there are different kind of perspectives to look at that. The other thing that I wanted to add is one thing that some families I've worked with aren't initially aware of is that they may be eligible for a legal status. So there are programs like the U visa, where if you're a victim of a crime or domestic violence and you've collaborated with law enforcement, you may be eligible for certain status. There are programs like asylum, which is becoming harder and harder to apply for, or some of these other little opportunities that sometimes people don't know they qualify for, but they can often connect with like a pro bono or nonprofit legal agency and perhaps find status that way if they're not immediately aware that they may qualify for something. But to be totally honest, like those opportunities are limited, right? Even those services only take a certain number of cases.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, I mean, trying to wrap my head around what it must be like to be undocumented in this country and to have, and especially like people that don't, you know, have any sort of like other like familial support or like happen to find a way that they can work or whatever. Just that kind of like being kind of completely caught in between, like being here and not being able to be here, and like being here and not being able to go anywhere else, but also just like not having access to any of the things that everybody else has. And it struck me like something like DACA isn't, I mean, it doesn't even give like these it's for childhood arrivals, right? Like kids who come in with their parents, like when they're really young, they've like
Right.
come out here. It doesn't give them citizenship. It's just saying like, we're gonna like not kick you out for a while because you have a whole life here, right? And it's like very structured and not everybody gets it. Like you have to, you know, apply or whatever. So I don't know. It just like trying to like at the same time, I'm trying to wrap my head around what it must be like to be undocumented in the country, especially like a childhood arrival and your like whole life is here. And then you mentioned that DACA is really controversial, which I was like, oh yeah, I guess it is. And that's kind of like hard for me to wrap my head around because even that is so limited in solving the problem that you're talking about, like so limited in. So I don't know, I guess I kind of wanted to ask like, and I don't know if this is like, what do you think about that controversy? Like, what do you think people have a hard time like wrapping their head around here that needs to change, or like, what, I don't know if you've experienced, like you've been with these populations, have you experienced people viewing them as a problem, or like as people that don't need help, or like, what do you think it is in other people's minds that makes DACA controversial, that's like hard for us to get to a more human way of approaching this population?
It's so funny that you asked that, because that is something I've been witnessing like face to face in my current position in the community I'm currently working in. So just to kind of fast forward, I'm currently a Stanford research fellow, and I'm part of a national study. It's a year-long, maybe a long-term project called the American Voices Project. Check it out online. And there's 70 fellows in every state and Puerto Rico. And we're going to a variety of different communities, urban populations, rural populations, suburbs. The cities and locations were based off of 2015 census information, and it is a poverty study. It is funded and coordinated through the Stanford Center on Inequality and Poverty. And so we're looking at how are people making ends meet, and how are we figuring out and better, more deeply understanding their views, their opinions, their suggestions, their qualms with the current state of the US given their life story. So it's a qualitative project, meaning we do like 2 to 3 hour long interviews, and we open with "Tell me the story of your life." And then we ask a series of questions that range from healthcare to how they feel about their particular cities to what are their political opinions and what do they value, right? So the interesting thing of what you're kind of getting at is the story and context of their life often answers questions like yours. Although the sites are confidential, I can't really reveal publicly where we are, because it's really important that we secure the privacy of the respondents in the study. I am currently in a very conservative part of the country. People identify mostly as Republican, but it of course is a low income community as well. And so where I kind of sat in your seat for my whole life wondering, how could a program that benefits hardworking, smart, motivated children be in any way controversial? How could anyone have a problem with that? And people have been very honest about why they feel that way, why they maintain certain beliefs around various races and cultural groups. And I think learning and looking at the context of their life story, what adversities they themselves have faced, how they perceive their world, has actually given me a little bit of insight into that. And so, for example, I had a few interviews last week with people who said things, for example, like DACA is caca, or things like, I'm really in favor of the southern border or the southern wall being constructed. I love Trump, things like that, right? So people who are very much aligned with getting rid of a program like DACA. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so what I learned is these people may had often started their narrative with, I faced this adversity. I was screwed over by this system. I didn't get what I wanted when I tried to apply for this program. I wasn't eligible for this. I had this trauma. And now look where I am. I'm not getting what I want. And I have this perception that this other population is getting everything they want, right? And so a lot of people will grasp onto beliefs about folks from other cultures or groups or demographics overutilizing the system, taking advantage, right?
And it comes out to this kind of like zero-sum mentality of like, if you're getting help, I can't get that help. Or like, if anybody else is getting something, especially somebody that I perceive as other, probably, I feel like race is huge here, like, then you're getting something that therefore I'm not getting, and which kind of creates that like pull where you're against anything that might be benefiting somebody that's different than you, because you feel this yourself.
Sure, it's going to be like this understanding or perceived understanding that there's limited resources, and that if you're taking some, that what's going to happen. Hannah, I want to touch on something that you mentioned when you were describing the work you did. You clarified not to speak on behalf of this population. And the title of this podcast is What is an Ally and What does it take to be one? I would assume that I've always felt that you are an ally of of multiple demographics. So that's why we decided to have you on the podcast. And so I wanted to say thank you for being an ally and recognizing who you are and the demographics that you work with. And I think recognition of who you are is so important when you are working with a group that's different from you. And so I think this is a great segue into kind of your recognizing, well, let's not only explaining to us, but our audience, how do you identify? What is your identity? How do you think it relates to the work that you're doing? I had an opportunity to read your personal statement when you applied to your master's program at Berkeley. And you did make a connection between your identity and the history of the Jewish community to the current, we can say current obstacles that Latinx communities are facing.
Yeah, absolutely. And while I do feel strongly about that connection, I also think it's important to recognize that no two communities are the same. No two forms of oppression or adversity are the same. But one thing about my own familial history that I think has brought me even closer to the work that I do is, yes, I identify as a white woman and a Jewish woman. And both sides of my family were impacted by the Holocaust, by genocide. They resettled in the United States. In fact, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. And that experience of relocating, resettling, escaping persecution or danger, and the inability to live life on a very basic level to meet your own needs without being targeted and having a real threat to your life is something that I think is very much embedded in my own family story and the various values and traditions that I was brought up in as a Jewish person. Now, the way in which my own community operates or lives on a day-to-day basis is very much its own. And I hate to draw comparisons to any other communities that I'm working with, because again, I feel like each group of people is very unique and special in its own way. And what you mentioned of like never speaking on behalf of a community is so important. And I try to be really careful about that, especially because I'm often, like, you know, as you said, an other in these different situations that I've been in my career and otherwise. That being said, all I can do as a quote unquote ally, which is a huge huge compliment to me as a person in this field, and a term that I don't even think I fully understand. I just, in my work, in the different positions I've held, really seen myself as more than anything a witness and a listener, and someone who can stand there, sit there and bear witness and listen, and sometimes validate and reflect back and try to empathize and put myself in someone else's situation, and then use these other parts of my identity to support or advocate or bolster. That being said, I don't need to be there for anyone to flourish or anyone to move up or anyone to mobilize. I don't need to be there, but it is something that I feel personally and professionally invested in. Yeah. And I hope that kind of gets to what you're saying about this, about how my own positionality impacts my ability to work with different demographics and populations, because I know it's a really sensitive topic and it's a really complex topic. So I try to approach it with incredible nuance, and most importantly, in the listener position.
Yeah, that's really well said, and I see you approaching it with a lot of nuance and humility and the listening. I think that's really well said, and I was kind of noticing, I think what it seems like you're mostly talking about there is how you are trying to be an ally, how you're trying to be in your work with these other populations. And I think that was really, really well said. I appreciate that, and I also am trying to embody a similar thing as a white man in my universe, to be listening to other people mostly, and like being of help where I can. But I'm curious on the other side of this, like that's in one context. How do you think of allyship, or how do you think of being an ally when you're in white communities or Jewish communities, I guess, like the other places where you identify, like the communities that are not the populations that you're helping, maybe, and maybe you would say the same thing, but I kind of felt like when you were talking about listening, you're mostly talking about the work that you do, like the different populations that have very different experiences in the world than you do as a Jewish woman, as a white woman. And so something that I've been thinking about a lot is how to be an ally with other white people, like what it means to be an ally in those other contexts that I find myself in, which weirdly to me has felt more difficult. I think there's definitely like an ego thing, like when I'm helping other populations or I'm listening, I almost like feel that I'm being a good ally. Like there's like sometimes I can feel good about it in a way that when I'm with other white people, I feel like I struggle more with like, how do I be vocal, or how do I be a good ally here, in this community that I'm a part of?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And again, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer it, but I would say one thing you mentioned that is so important is this thing about ego, right? And I think it is such it's just something that's not talked about in these conversations of advocate or allies or, you know, partners or whatever. And that's because when we look at these things, we really have to wonder and self-interrogate, are we aligning? Are we advocating? Are we even listening to increase our own social capital? Are we trying to involve ourselves in certain causes because it makes ourselves look good? We like how we appear in our own origin communities. We like how it could even present on social media. So I always have to consider that when I'm doing the work that I do and really thinking about my own social capital and my own benefit in the work that I do. So I think that's something that quote unquote allies should be continuously checking in with themselves on, is where do I, when I step into this role, when I step into this environment, how is it impacting me in the way I'm perceived? And on a very honest and deep and sometimes humbling level, why am I doing it, right? So that's one element of it. And then to get to your question about how to bring allyship into white communities, I think one way in which that can be attempted is this idea of dispelling myths, right? So we talked a little bit about that earlier. A lot of people I've encountered or come into contact with who identify as white have various myths about other demographics, other populations, the ways in which they navigate or utilize systems, the ways in which they interact in the world. And oftentimes that's because they're sheltered in their own community, right? Like they're not engaging with others. They're not even doing the research. And as we all know, even when you do the research, your source is everything. And you might be getting manipulated data or information or news or what have you. So I think one way in which I try and bring that piece of me into other white or Jewish spaces is to really cite the work that I've done, the firsthand witnessed accounts of these things, and even the factual information around how certain things work. You know what? I've helped people apply for Medi-Cal, and here's how it works. Here are the requirements. I know this because I've sat there while people are denied. And this is actually how things work, and this is actually what I know. So doing the research, not just from news sources, but really getting at the complicated nature of the various structures and systems of social programs or various events or phenomena can be a really powerful tool. And it can also be a slippery slope, because in those cases, you can sort of find yourself coming back to this, well, I don't want to speak for someone else's experience. Well, I don't want to talk to what they're going through. But it can also be a tool if used appropriately and correctly. The other quick thing I want to add to that, and if I'm talking too much, please interrupt me.
No, keep going.
Okay, is opening up those conversations within people who hold some of those alternative viewpoints to you, people who have certain strong views about DACA, or people who you would never think do. But opening up those conversations and even bringing your listener positionality to those spaces can be really powerful in the ways that you can help people process and learn and think through these different myths and thoughts that they hold that may not actually be grounded in truth and fact. And those are some conversations I've had with anyone from an acquaintance, someone I meet at a party, a family member, and really not shaming them or judging them in those moments, but allowing them to open up and asking them questions and maybe softly probing or pushing back to challenge their viewpoints to get to the truth or the fact is another way that I feel like I can respectfully bring forth my own beliefs and my own experiences into those spaces. I hope that makes sense.
So, yeah. So I've got a question, and as for both of you, where do you see those those places for you all to initiate those conversations,
Mm-hmm.
right? You talk about in social settings, and I think that can be really difficult, you know, and this is coming from someone who doesn't bring up, I'm in a ton of situations where I am the only person of color, and I'd rather not be that person to bring it up, right? I'm like, yeah, I deal with this every day. I'd love to talk about it. I don't necessarily feel like it's my job to initiate this conversation. But I could imagine, regardless of your ethnicity or whatever demographic you identify with, that can be a difficult conversation to bring up. And it honestly could alter your viewpoint on some of your friends, your other groups you belong to. I'm not sure if a lot of people are ready for that. I'm not sure if a lot of people are ready to start tackling these tougher conversations. I mean, I've had this with, I have this conversation with others, and I have a conversation with myself. Like, if I brought this up to some of my friends, or some of the issues that I see, you know, police brutality, immigration reform, I'm not sure how many relationships would remain constant, because I think we would differ, and I just think we, you know, naturally we'd go different ways. So I know that was a little long-winded.
No, it's
but,
a really good question.
Yeah.
I mean, something that just kind of connected for me with what you were saying, and I think what you said earlier, Hannah, is the way that you, and I think that I even struggle. So like, I'll just talk for me, because I think that everybody, especially this is vastly different for you bringing up these conversations
Sure.
with white people, or like in mostly white spaces where you're like one of few or the only person of color. Obviously it's a different thing for me, but I think that there is for everybody like a place for anger and grief and, you know, being really firm about the facts and like dispelling myths. And I think also though, Hannah, you talked about kind of being gentle with these people in some ways, like somebody who might not agree with you or might not understand, or like being in a white space and trying to kind of not shame somebody, but like help them along. And I've been thinking a lot about that, because I do think that that's like an important piece, and it's not always doable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that especially for somebody like me who is not personally affected in the same way that you are, like if we're in the same space, like I'm not feeling the same things in my body that you are, like I don't have the same kind of feelings about like, you know, who I am and my safety, and like there's just like a lot of other things
Sure.
that are going on, like the cognitive load, the emotional load that you would carry in a mostly white space is different. I think that because I am recognizing that like I have this privilege to not feel all of those things, to be in a space and just feel like pretty safe, you know,
Sure.
pretty like okay, that maybe that's a privilege, and that maybe like I can use that privilege to be a little bit more patient or a little bit more gentle or like a little bit more something to like try to bring people along, so that my presenting the facts or like trying to bring up a difficult conversation, or even just kind of like addressing a random comment. Because I think like to get to your question a little bit of like, when do you bring this stuff up, or what spaces, like,
Yeah.
I think that it's like everything. Like for me, I'm thinking of, you know, extended family dinners, work, friends, like family back home I'm talking to, just like all kinds of situations I find myself in where it's mostly white people or all white people, and like a little something gets brought up that like makes me uncomfortable, or I know is rooted in racism or privilege or bias that's like unexamined, and it's so easy to just like let that go, and not say anything, and just kind of feel like, and even sometimes, Hannah, to your thing earlier, like feel a little good almost ego-wise to like have noticed it, but like still not necessarily say anything, because it's like so hard to do that. So I think, I mean, for me, it's like all of these spaces, and I really appreciate what you said, Hannah, about dispelling myths and having facts. I've been like personally feeling like I want to do better at remembering facts and numbers. Like I've been reading like the street sheet that the Coalition on Homelessness puts out, and reading through some of the numbers of just like the unhoused population in the city and the disproportionate way that that affects people of color and the LGBTQ community. And I started like taking an extra moment to try to like remember those numbers, because I think that that really helps and is something that I haven't taken a lot of like time or effort to do. But I think that like, yeah, the facts thing helps. And then I think that like I'm starting to feel like part of what I can offer, or part of what like my privilege in a mostly white space, the privilege that I have to just feel pretty chill there compared to you, like something that I can do with that privilege is maybe be a little bit more patient, a little bit more like, I want to like kind of help teach people, like bring them along, because I had to be brought along. Like I had to have somebody like handhold me into understanding what white privilege and white supremacy in this country is. And I'm grateful that people were willing to be patient enough with me to get me there, at least initially. But that is like a huge, like to be that patient is a huge burden on people of color that like, I think often white people put on them to like teach us, explain it, help us. And so I don't know, I think that like part of being an ally is taking some of that burden and being like, okay, like it's easier for me to try to bring people along, to like, try to like, I don't know.
People that are more like you.
Yeah, like bring white people along.
Exactly.
Right,
Right.
Yeah. Only talk about white people in that situation. Like it is like, yeah. That like other white people that don't recognize their privilege, that have all these myths about other populations or races or immigrant, whatever the issue is, like that. I think that it does take, like when people feel a lot of shame and defensiveness, it's just like so impossible for people to change their mind. It's just so impossible. And it's like, if we want people to change their minds, I think you have to have some element of like trying to help reduce shame and like be gentle with them, even if like their position is just nuts. Like even if it's just like really rooted in white supremacy and racism, and it's like so hard to hear. I don't know.
I think what you're getting at is absolutely true. And, you know, two of the things I really want to highlight and kind of uplift is this very delicate position that allies kind of have to navigate, which is, I don't want to place the burden on marginalized communities or folks of color to address these situations or address these comments. That is not their role, and it should not be another form of social stress that's placed on them, but simultaneously allowing space for people to speak for themselves and not speak on behalf of them. And it's there, you know, there's no guidebook on how to do that, because it's really about reading a situation and reading a room and being sort of tapped into how people are reacting, but really being so aware of that burden being placed on others and stepping into those situations.
Hold on 1 second. We're in the library and the lovely librarian said, just keep it down a little bit.
You know,
I'm assuming that's us and not you.
Yeah. That sounds good.
Oh, what?
You're fine.
You're fine.
I think it's
okay.
My voice carries, so when I was talking for a long time, that probably got.
Oh, I see. Well, let me know if I'm too loud.
No. You're fine.
It's fine.
The other thing that you were talking about is how when you address those conversations, how I too have this like very strong physical reaction, and it's exhausting, and I get headaches. And when I sit and kind of bear and absorb these really toxic, in my opinion, toxic viewpoints, it feels so sickening and exhausting to me, because when you kind of try and open up that non-judgmental, unbiased space to let people explore these viewpoints with you, you know, you're receiving it at the same time. And one thing I try to remember is, yeah, this is uncomfortable and I hate it. And it's kind of requiring everything from me to not be like, fuck Trump or whatever the case is. I really try and check in and be like, God, but at the end of the day, look at my positionality and look about how I'm going to re-enter the world as this person. And the communities that are being attacked and targeted by certain other communities are the ones that are kind of holding this weight on their back every single day, regardless of if I have this uncomfortable conversation. And more in my career, I'm trying to embrace discomfort, because I think as a social worker, that is one of the best strategies to help people heal or better understand themselves, and to sit in discomfort, and to even have like a maybe internal little monologue with myself while I'm trying to listen to them, of like where I'm going with this, what's happening, how I feel, maybe how I'm going to feel later, that sort of thing. And sliding into that role a little bit more and more. But I echo everything you're saying, Austin. Like, yeah, I was even talking to Joseph last week, and I was like so spent after having so many of these conversations where people were saying things that just like go against everything I feel, believe, see, witness in the world. But
Well, I really like that you are talking about discomfort and getting used to it, because I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that white people are very used to being comfortable. Where I was actually just glossing over an article that I never finished that you sent me a long time ago by Robin DiAngelo about white fragility. And it's just that, I mean, the whole concept of white fragility comes from the reality that as a white person in this country, I haven't had to be aware of race, or really my own race. I haven't been at any disadvantage because of the color of my skin. Like, I just have kind of been able to expect, at least around race, that things are fairly comfortable, or like it's just kind of the water I swim in. Like, I don't really need to notice it. And I think talking about discomfort is really important, that we kind of welcome it. Like, that's something that like people of color experience, like, you know, not even just discomfort, but like pain and suffering. It goes like, there's a spectrum of it, but like discomfort is the baseline for other people in this country. And I think most white people just are used to like, well, we can probably feel comfortable. Or even like, I went through, when I first started to understand what white privilege was, I went through this struggle of, oh, this is a new thing that I'm learning, and now I kind of expected that I could get it right, like that I could just know what to do, and then I would have the right answer, and then I would be a good ally because I, you know, read or understood a few things. And it's taking me a long time to realize that, like, no, I don't get to just be right. There's no one way to do this. There's no way to like figure it out and then do the right thing and then be comfortable because I figured it out, even though I kind of expect that I can get to that point because of the way that my life has been. And so that's been a big theme for me too, is like trying to get used to the discomfort, and to say that like being uncomfortable is the work. There's not like a way to get to like a right answer where everybody just feels great. Like, you have to kind of sit in that.
Yeah, and what Joseph was talking about potentially sacrificing relationships, that's a really hard thing, because you want to have these conversations, you want to have the uncomfortable conversations, but in a very real way, it can impact how you relate to that person, how you view them, how much time you want to spend around them, and how you perceive them, like the lens that you're looking through, now that you know that this like kind of deep-seated viewpoint that perhaps you weren't aware of before is really part of who they are and how they operate. And that can be difficult too. Part of the work that we're talking about is having an integrated view of people, and realizing that these conversations can open up deep-seated beliefs that, kind of what I was trying to say earlier, can be rooted in their upbringing, their trauma, their adversity, not to in any way justify what they're putting forth or what they're saying. But sometimes we can plant a seed or loosen a screw by kind of like airing it out a little bit, exploring it, asking leading questions, providing some statistical information or factual information. But I will be totally honest, I have, done some permanent damage to relationships through conversations, people that I, no longer speak to, conversations that perhaps got too too involved or too heated or whatever the case is. And I think part of the work is also realizing that that's okay.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
I mean, it's okay to grow apart from people, distance yourself from people who you no longer align with. Ideally, we want to continue to have these conversations and have an integrated view of how people can see things and why they see things the way they do, or what life experiences have brought them to their beliefs. But I try and be like generous with myself in times when I feel like, okay, well, we no longer have a friendship or we no longer have a relationship because of this conversation, and this is something I can't get over. That's human to me. And sometimes that needs to happen. I don't think there's any right or wrong.
Yeah.
So something that just clicked between your explanation, Hannah, and you, Austin, is this idea of change, right? We have to be okay with things changing. And you were talking about, understanding that, even if I do get these statistics and I am starting to become knowledgeable on some this subject matter, it's still understanding that these things constantly change, right? There's going to be nuance in systemic oppression. It's not always going to be the exact same conversation. So it's important that we're consistently having the conversations and feeling comfortable in doing so. And so I kind of want to segue into kind of what it takes to be an ally. If we're talking to someone, it's like, all right, that's great. Like, Hannah, you seem like you're doing a great job. Because one of the things that I see is that I think people are doing a better job of listening, right? So if there's something we can really say, that's something I can say that seems to be changing for the better, is people are starting to have the ability to listen to the tough stuff. Like, okay, I can listen. I think the next step is kind of like advocating, right, within your own community. The step I think that hopefully comes next, or that I'm not seeing, is the action. Right, change does not happen without an actionable step. Right, so I guess I'm asking, do you kind of agree with these three steps? Kind of, if you're an ally, maybe your first job is to listen, advocate, and then maybe third step is take action. If there's something else you want to add to it, please do. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that I would almost even layer that with a constant process of self-reflection. Because while you're advocating, while you're listening, I think someone who's committed to allyship is constantly checking in with themselves and realizing, yeah, I hold biases. I look at the world through my own particular perspective that is biased, and I see certain people in a certain way. Everyone does. And not being ashamed to own that and accept that and process it and like call it out and make it real to yourself, and then not beat yourself up over it. I think that's how we work through our own biases, no matter what positionality we hold, is to constantly say, like, you know what, I kind of had this physical or emotional reaction to this person or this situation, and I'm going to bring it to the forefront of my consciousness, but I'm not going to punish myself for it. I'm going to be aware of it. I'm going to think how I would prefer to view the situation based on my own ethics and morals, and I'm going to own it and move on, and not continuously punish myself for the way that I might be perpetuating these systems or viewpoints. So I would also add that a constant process of self-reflection is really important in this work, because even if you're like, I'm an ally, I'm committed to this, I know I'm doing things that are good, no one's perfect, and we're always integrating these like various things that just come from our own personal existence. So I would agree. And everything else that you said, I think is exactly spot on. And the action piece can be the hardest, right?
Right.
Because it looks different for every single person. Not every person is going to want to enter the field of community organizing or social work or medicine or psychology. That is not everyone's preferred career path, and it shouldn't be. Like, our world, community, society is special and functional because people can work in different departments, in different industries, and that we shouldn't shame or guilt people for that. I think that is a sort of unspoken thing. Oh, because you work for X industry, like, you're not sort of about a cause. And that's not true at all.
Sure.
Advocacy and action can look different for every single person, no matter what role they play or how they spend their time or what career they're a part of. We think about different things that you can do in your day-to-day life, or how you bring different perspectives into your workplace culture, or what businesses you patronize, or how, people like in Austin's position are really researching and educating themselves on the facts so they can infuse it into the social environments that they're in. You don't need to go and volunteer every single day to be a good advocate or a good activist. You have to be aware, contribute when you can. I think volunteerism and service should definitely be a part of people's lives if they are able to. Some people are not able to. Some people work all the time and they have to. Some people have to take care of others. That's understandable. That's human life. That's not something people should be ashamed of or guilty about. But I think the more and more we can expose ourselves to issues that we care about, the better advocates and allies we can be. We can talk about anecdotal experiences. We can talk about that one person we met during this volunteer experience that really changed our perception. And perhaps if someone else knew the story, they might feel a little bit different because now it's personalized and now it's coming from someone they care about and respect who has exposed themselves to this particular social problem. So I feel that this particular role can be expanded. It can across like all different roles or areas of one's life, depending on how they want to integrate it and like what is even feasible for them.
Yeah.
So that's my
opinion. That's
really well said.
Yeah, it's extremely well said.
That's helpful for me. I was thinking too, like, I wanted to kind of broach that topic of like, how do you take action? What does that look like for different people? And I think the way that you just said all of that was really expansive and helpful to kind of like articulate where different people are and what different capacities you might have, and the importance for people across, locations, industries, nonprofit, politics, companies, whatever you find yourself doing. If you can find a population that, or a problem that resonates with you, people that are in your neighborhood or your community, if you can give one volunteer day a week, or like vote on important things, like there's all of these different things. If you just like find a couple ways, like if you think about what can take action mean, like what's a feasible way in your daily, maybe weekly life, monthly life, to take action on these things and to not just let it end at conversations and like listening and advocating, then there's like a million different ways that you could do that fit in with, whatever your needs are and what you're capable of and what makes the most sense. But I think I'm always trying to like, that's hard for me sometimes because I'm trying to listen really well, and then I hear all of the different problems and all the things I care about, and it's like, it's overwhelming. And I think that sometimes people, once they let in the reality of the problem, the reality of maybe their privilege, then it feels like paralyzing to do anything, because it's like everything needs help. And so I like the way that you said that, and I was just thinking in my head, like, okay, yeah, like find something, pick something, and like get going on it, and maybe that will like grow into something bigger. It's just like an hour a week, or it's like researching and voting in every election. It could be a lot of different things, but like letting that be what it needs to be for you, and just like keeping in mind that like it's about regularly taking action in some way, and not just like putting your head in the sand because you've kind of started to become aware of the problems. And I think that happens a lot too. Like people kind of like struggle at every stage of this little allyship kind of model that we've been building as we've had this conversation of like,
Yeah.
it's hard to listen sometimes to other people. And then it's like people struggle with the advocating part. Like, I think I've been thinking about that a lot. Like, how do I better advocate in my white communities? Because it's easy to just let things slide and keep the peace. And then I think once you get to that and you're starting to have those conversations, it can be easy to stall out at just listening and advocating and not doing anything and feeling overwhelmed by the problem. So the way that you just like articulated that was really helpful for me.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think one of the, I think you're familiar, and if you're not familiar, Hannah, Austin and I have had 2 thus far Feed the People events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
We've
had,
I'm familiar.
Yes.
I know all about your work.
So this idea of being overwhelmed with obstacles that we have in society is really what birthed Feed the People. You know, I was thinking about how can we make some type of change, and specifically here in San Francisco, we're seeing, I would say, the most divisive culture since I've been alive, right?
Yeah, we have like, you know, an insane, well, yeah, now that I'm starting to memorize my statistics, like the unhoused population has ballooned to like almost 10,000 people in the city. And
really,
like the most, you know, affluent, I think there's more like billionaires per capita in, you know, San Francisco, Silicon Valley area than anywhere else in the country. And so like the disparity is massive. And of course, like, you know, that population is very, I mean, it's like I think that there's like 5% Black people in the city now, and Black people that make up the unhoused population are 30%. Like, it's very similar with the LGBTQ community. Like, some of these like more marginalized people based on sexuality or race are overrepresented in the population of people that are unhoused and like struggling in the city that has more wealth than, you know, the top 10% of people really know what to do with. And I think that's such a good example, because like even, and it like, I just want to still speak to this, is even sometimes with Feed the People, like we got out there, we're like, we can do this. Like, we're going to feed people. We're going to connect some tech companies to these populations, and like the, you know, connecting people and like actually like going out and feeding 200 people, like giving them a meal and a bunch of supplies that are needed is awesome. And there is still so many times where like I look at it and there's this part of me that feels like this isn't even making a dent. Like, the problem is so big and it's so overwhelming to think about the wealth that we have in the city on one hand, and then like the people at the lowest rungs just trying to find shelter every night. And part of that makes me want to like put my head in the sand again. Like, it's still even a struggle, even though some people would look and be like, oh, you're doing this great thing. You just like put it together and did it. Like, and it is something, but it is, it's still hard to just sometimes keep doing the thing in front of you and like keep trying to like take action when you're aware of how big the problem is.
Right. And I think that one thing, I often feel that way as a social worker, or even as a case manager. I felt like, God, like, there were times where I would tell people, there's literally nothing I can do to meet this like basic need that you're coming to me with. I wish I could provide housing for you tonight, but like, our shelters are so impacted. The housing market is totally full. Like, it can get really overwhelming. One thing that I think balances some of that internal anxiety I carry when I look at these situations is really familiarizing myself with the agencies, the politicians, and the movements that exist and are out there doing this work every day, creating innovative solutions to the housing crisis. I've seen some really cool sort of alternative ways to house different populations, and looking at what is being done and what fight others and this larger community of allies or advocates or whatever you want to call these people are doing on a day-to-day basis, how they're pushing and where they're finding their hope and their ends, and what are the victories in addition to failures that they may be experiencing too. And really being part of those networks and circles can make this work feel more sustainable and less like personally taxing, because you're part of this with a larger group that is maybe housing a family every day, if it's just one family, that is a whole different trajectory that that family now has. And grounding yourself in those sort of efforts and those sort of moments can be helpful. It doesn't take away the bigger anxieties that we hold, especially if we're looking at like more national phenomena. I know San Francisco and the changes that it's experienced are incredibly, I don't even know how to capture that, influential in the way that they've impacted my life and other people. But those are some ways that I kind of try and balance those feelings and experiences, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, you talk about partnering and recognizing that there are other people doing this work. So we partnered with the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, and yeah, I've had Tyrone Anderson, who's been with the organization for I want to say close to 8 years or something like that. Come in and do trainings for organizations that volunteer for Feed the People, and that way, you know, there is, I guess you could call it a more holistic approach, as opposed to Austin and I come in and saying, hey, you know, this would be a really good idea if you come. But if we have someone who's worked with the population and understands them a little bit more, then we'll have a better event. I see Feed the People as not only a service project, hopefully with these communities that have moved to San Francisco, and it's not just San Francisco, right? And other places in the world, hopefully it's an opportunity to be exposed to what's happening, right? There, we have to admit that there are people who they can live in the same city but have no exposure to the community. I was recently watching a documentary about Skid Row down in LA, right? You have this dense area of poverty and crime that we don't really talk about in this Hollywood influenced city, right?
Yes.
And yeah, it's important that we expose people. And I do think that if we're talking about our community here in San Francisco, that if you're doing business here, then I would say you have an obligation to the communities that you're serving or are not serving, for that matter, you know. Yeah, we don't want to. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, because you've done more than I think both of us could ask for. But again, we really want to thank you for taking the time on your Sunday afternoon to talk more about, you know, what brought you to the work you're currently doing, your suggestions to us and our audience as to how, you know, they can take steps to being an ally or improve on what they're doing now. And yeah, just overall, thank you.
Yeah, echo all of that. Yeah, this has been immensely helpful and encouraging for me, and it's great to see your wisdom and vulnerability and humility kind of all come out at once. Yeah, you have a really powerful way of communicating all of these like really complicated and nuanced things, and I very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. You give me way too much credit. I feel like I ramble a lot, and I certainly don't have all the answers. But the approach, I just want to say the approach that Love Lab is taking in tackling these uncomfortable issues, bringing together different communities, exploring complicated, nuanced issues with sensitivity and humility is really inspirational to me. And I think, like, you know, continue to expand your people and the places and groups that you're a part of, and like have this conversation 10 more times and you'll get 10 more perspectives. And it's always really a blessing to talk to both of you. And I'm super grateful that you invited me on. And yeah, thanks.
Is there any way for people to look up, or maybe we can put this in kind of like some notes along with the podcast,
support the work you're doing?
Just to support the work you're doing, get
Sure.
more education on the work you're doing, or somehow connect with you if they have any.
Of course, absolutely. I can provide some contact information and maybe some of the organizations I partner with if people want to get involved. I'd be happy to do that. And please reach out. I love chatting with folks if they're interested.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Wonderful. All right.
Do I hang up?
No. I mean, if you don't.